Well, good afternoon, and welcome to part 5 of our 6-part series looking at the United States Constitution, past as well as into the present, projecting onwards to the future. Well, we were talking in terms of earlier presentations going back here to 1787 and the Constitutional Convention, in terms here of establishing a strong federal government, which was an absolute necessity, no doubt about that. The British had been defeated here formally in the Revolutionary War, 1776 and all that. And what you have here in Philadelphia that summer were these three branches, an executive branch, a judicial branch, as well as a legislative branch, put here in operation, in essence, a system of checks and balances so that not one of the three branches would become too powerful over the other two, or two would become more powerful than just one of them. So you have this power sharing agreement in essence, or checking and balancing power across the board. Well, from the standpoint of James Madison, the father of the Constitution, of course there were countless other contributors. He was probably the most prominent of them all with his Virginia Plan. As far as he was concerned here, this was this living, breathing document, which it is proven to be. But by the same end here, if changes were going to be made, and inevitably he thought they would need to be made as time in fact formally marched on in this nation, which at the time only had a population of about just under 4 million people. So it's very, very small, especially by European standards at that stage. And from his outlook, you could have these additions, these changes, these amendments formally being brought to bring about a more equal, or to respond to the times, so to speak, etc., to make this a very flexible document, this Constitution. Well, immediately, as we saw in earlier presentations, you have states along the eastern seaboard who were fearful of a strong federal government, were fearful that these three large states were going to take advantage of the 10 smaller states, and they demand a Bill of Rights. So hence you have the first 10 amendments here to the Constitution known as the Bill of Rights. Remember, there's only a total of 27 of those. So almost here, well, more than 1/3 are going to come just within the years of 1787 to 1791, that this will be formally established here, this Bill of Rights, which will bring about changes, additions to guarantee the rights of states, and that larger states won't take advantage of smaller states, and the right to bear arms, and right to a fast trial, innocent until proven guilty, all these sorts of things. Here, right to a jury trial, that all of this will be etched in stone as well. James Madison did not want to add a Bill of Rights. He thought it was good enough the way it was, but he realized he had no choice. So the first 10 amendments are added, and the nation itself is going to move forward. Well, we talked here that in the years that follow, there would only be a total of 17 amendments added to this Constitution. It is the oldest Constitution, of course, in the world. Now, as we're celebrating very, very soon the official 250th anniversary of the birth of this nation in 1776, of course, on the 4th of July. But we also stress the fact that what is really a crisis, or really a challenge, is you have a situation that for the founding fathers, they're not going to deal with this issue, the institution of slavery. Much of this had to do with the fact that of those delegates at the Constitutional Convention, the vast majority of them were slaveholders. For those who weren't slaveholders, and for those who spoke out very fervently against the institution of slavery, Governor Morris was probably the best example of that from the state of Pennsylvania. They represented here the minority voice, and furthermore, they knew that it was something that was not even going to be discussed, talked about in terms of long-term institution, etc. So slavery here, for the founding fathers, this institution would be kicked further on down the road. The slave trade would be abolished, as we referenced, in 1807. But as the 19th century progressed, you have more and more of a divide going on in the respective nation over this very institution. Because as far as the northern states, and soon to be the Midwestern states, as they're coming into existence by the mid-19th century, as far as they are concerned here, their focus is going to be on modernizing, industrializing here, manufacturing, following his example set with the onset of the Industrial Revolution by Britain in 1760, followed up here by France, followed up as well by the Germanic Confederation. They saw here this as the way effectively forward. By comparison, the southern states with this institution of slavery, a traditional-based economy, they saw themselves as representing the true Americans, representing here the time of the birth of the nation when the vast majority of the Founding Fathers were, in fact, here slave owners. And that the northern states had no say whatsoever in terms of how the southern states are going to conduct themselves or how they are going to, in fact, here live their lives. Their livelihood here in this slave-based economy was fundamental. Well, the southern states are insecure, and obviously, understandably, why? Because the Northeast really wants to see slavery officially end. And what you have here is the 19th century continues more and more of a divide, as the South here would continue to demand for every new free state that is going to be added to the Union. Here, as you have this movement of manifest destiny from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, you add here 2 free states, you got to add 2 slave states. This is the last thing as far as the northern politician and statesmen were concerned they wanted to do. What they wanted instead is to isolate this institution of slavery in the southeast of the United States, and eventually it's going to wither, it's going to die on the vine as the nation becomes larger and more prominent. Well, unfortunately here, compromise was essential, as we saw at the Constitutional Convention. It would also be an essential part here of the early aspect of American history, but by the time we get to the mid-19th century, there's no more room for compromise. No more room for compromise, and the net result is going to be following the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860, this Republican candidate for the White House. What you will have here is the southern states who have been long threatening. They are going to effectively now follow through on their secession of the Union. They're leaving once and for all. And they want nothing to do due to the fact that the Republican Party, this new political party from Ripon, Wisconsin, born in 1854, has as part of its political platform here an anti-slave platform. And as far as the southern states are concerned, enough is enough. We cannot work here with these northerners any longer, and they will begin to secede, starting first in December of 1860 with South Carolina. 11 southern states would eventually here formally secede. Abraham Lincoln, the new president of the United States, by the time he becomes president and formally takes the oath of office in March of 1861, 7 southern states are already here free. They have freed themselves of the Union. They are rebellion. This is an act of treason, as also clearly stated in the Constitution. And in this situation here, as far as they are concerned, they are establishing their own nation, the Confederate States of America. Well, Lincoln is never going to refer here, this new president, to the Confederate States as a confederacy. Not in any way, shape, or form is he going to give them any legitimacy. And the net result is he will wait for the South to fire the first shot. And of course, the first shot is effectively fired in April of 1861, and the American Civil War here effectively begins. So these issues that weren't resolved or really weren't even discussed, and I'm not saying they should or they shouldn't have been, but they weren't. Here you have the net result that there really is no room for compromise. There's really no other way of avoiding this. How much longer can you kick the can on down the road? And the net result here of this great American experiment here is going to, in fact, be the American Civil War. Well, as we stressed last time at our conclusion, the northern states have huge advantages. The Union has huge, huge advantages. The first big advantage is that they can field an army 3 times the size of that of the South. The second big advantage is that you have not only the northeastern part of the United States being very modern, very industrial by mid-19th century standards, so too are the Midwestern states, or they're certainly here catching up in a very, very rapid fashion. So you have here a tremendous amount of industry, a tremendous amount of wealth. In fact, across the entire nation, North and South combined, over 85% here of the industry, of the wealth of the nation resides in the northern states. The third big reason here, the third big issue that the Union also has as its advantage is it has a navy. The South does not have a navy. It does not have here any way effectively of defending itself in the event of a naval blockade or whatever the case would be. It doesn't have railroad tracks. It has railroad tracks to some extent, but over 80% of the railroad tracks across here, the United States at this time, are all located exclusively in the northern states, which is also huge. So in this sense, heading into the American Civil War, the northern states are out to preserve the Union. They're out here to formally preserve the Union in 1861. This is the goal, the hope, the focus, the objective as to how the Founding Fathers saw this back in 1787 in Philadelphia at the convention that summer. And the powers that be, looking at this from an outside perspective, they have huge advantages. But the South also has advantages. The South also has some advantages here. They have the best trained officer corps from West Point, who overwhelmingly they are Southerners. That's one thing, but by the same end for the South, they just have to keep pushing here the North back, keep pushing the Union Army back, 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 back. They don't have to defeat the Union armies. They just have to hold on and hold out for as long as possible. And then eventually here the Union forces will give up. Third, for the Union forces, they're also going to have to control an area that is larger than all of Western Europe. In fact, 3 times larger than Western Europe. So if you look at it initially, the North has huge advantages. And the North indeed has huge advantages, no doubt about that. But when you look a little bit closer, it's not a level playing field. The North still has advantages, but the South here, the South is fighting primarily from a defensive posture. Well, the goal on the part of Lincoln, first and foremost, you take the U.S. Navy, you blockade the South. You blockade the South. You're going to take the Navy here around the entire South. You're not going to let anything in. You're not going to let anything out. The number one crop here, number one export, cotton, or what the Southerners refer to as King Cotton. And the largest recipients are indeed Britain and France. And as far as the South was concerned, what they wanted is they wanted the British and or the French to come and alleviate here this Union blockade. Because if they do that, that's going to help the South economy. Otherwise, they're going to slowly but sure be strangled into submission. Strangled here formally into submission. Well, this is the first goal. And Lincoln, President of the United States, is also desperate. He is desperate to keep the British and the French out of this war. He doesn't want them stepping in on the side of the South. Whether they would or not, that was the major question. Second of all, you've got this Eastern Theater. You have this Eastern Theater, which is going to basically be whoever wins the Eastern Theater, fought primarily in the state of Virginia, not too far from Washington, D.C. The major battles in the Eastern Theater will take place. Whoever wins the Eastern Theater here is going to prevail in this war. Virginia is by far the largest, the most prosperous of all Southern states, Confederate states here in this American Civil War. This is where the war will be won or lost. And for Lincoln, he is going to go through here a merry-go-round of generals. He can't find a general, whether it was George McClellan or Ambrose Burnside, whoever the case would be, who would fight aggressively against the South. They usually would go into battle, the Union forces, with a 2-to-1 superiority. And what Lincoln wanted here is for his generals in the Army of the Potomac to take advantage of this superiority, superior numbers, but more often than not, they did not. And even when they would win, he wanted them to pursue, and destroy here the Army of Northern Virginia under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, if that were at all possible. But even if the Union soldiers would win in a battle, seldom did they then follow up to try and do tremendous damage to the Southern forces that would prove to be enormously difficult to bounce back from. Lincoln realized if this war kept going on and on and on, across the northern states, the northern population would not be interested, and the net result would be the end of the Civil War and a 2-state solution, namely the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. By the same end, you're also going to have here this Western Theater. And the goal, the hope, the focus, the objective of the Western frontier, as was known as, which would basically be here that territory resting along the Mississippi River, that was considered the frontier here in the United States at this stage. That what you want to do is you want to gain control of the Mississippi River. Obviously, you have control in the northern states of the Mississippi coming down, but it's the southern states all the way to the Gulf of Mexico that you want to seal this area off. And in the Western Theater, if you can emerge victorious, here in this Western Theater, what you'll have is you've effectively driven a stake right down the middle of the southern states. It's going to push here Louisiana, it's going to push Texas and Arkansas, it's going to push them here beyond the Pale. And then you can focus here moving eastward across the historic South. Well, for Lincoln, the blockade's in effect. No problem. That's going to take time, in a slow, gradual process. The Eastern Theater, the Confederate armies here, especially those under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, they're holding their own. They're holding their own here effectively. And in the Western Theater, though, there was a good deal of Union success. And much of this was brought about by Ulysses S. Grant, as well as another general, William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman and Grant were working together here. Their goal, the hope, the focus, the objective is to seize full control, full control of the Mississippi River. And to basically, the Confederate forces had seized a number of federal forts, like Fort Donelson was one of them in early 1861, as well as Fort Henry. And what Grant as well as Sherman would do is they would follow in more of this meat grinder approach. They knew they had superior numbers. They weren't afraid to lose men. It was war after all. People are going to die. And it proved to be this more aggressive approach in the Western Theater. Very, very effective. Indeed, by the time we get to July of 1863, Grant and Sherman have been successful enough that the last great stronghold here along the Mississippi was Vicksburg, Mississippi. And here, what the Union forces will do in the Western Theater is they're going to set up this massive siege around the city of Vicksburg, not letting anything in, not letting anything out, demanding the formal surrender of the Confederate Army here in the West that is hunkered down at Vicksburg. On July 4th, 1863, the Confederate forces here in the Western Theater at Vicksburg officially surrender. They surrender. What this means is that the Western Theater now is formally won by the Union Army. The war here is more than 2 years old, but now full navigation of the Mississippi River is in control of the Union Army, and all of those Confederate states to the west of the Mississippi, Texas being the largest of them all, they are now cut off and isolated. What William Tecumseh Sherman is now going to do is he's going to begin driving across here the historic Southeast. And from the standpoint of Grant, there's a good deal of interest here regarding this one-time resident of Galena, Illinois, who had been a graduate of West Point and retired from the Army and gets married. He has 4 children, and he tries all sorts of different things in terms of livelihoods, and none of them were really much interest to him, and none of them succeeded either. Well, for this one-time resident of Ohio, who eventually relocates to Illinois, when the Civil War starts, he decides the one thing that he knew best, as far as he was concerned. He had been in the Mexican-American War some years before. The one thing he knew best was the military. So he is going to re-enlist, and he is going to be sent here into the Western Theater. Well, for Grant, it's victory after victory, despite the fact he also has here, he suffers a loss of a good many men. But as far as Lincoln is concerned here, and this photograph of Lincoln, this is also taken in 1862, he's meeting with George McClellan, who was at this time the general of the Army of the Potomac in the Eastern Theater. He's getting all the more frustrated with McClellan. He had relieved McClellan of his command already once. He brought him back in because he didn't have anybody else. And the progress that's being made in the Eastern Front is very, very slow. Yes, indeed, the Union Army won a significant victory at the Battle of Antietam. But more often than not, despite inferior numbers, Robert E. Lee and his Confederate forces would win here the better part of the battles in the East. And this was the more important theater, and it was, in fact, of grave concern. Well, Robert E. Lee, Supreme Commander here of the Confederate forces, overseeing the Army of Northern Virginia, the largest of all Confederate armies, he realizes here that this blockade that had been put in place by the United States Navy is really starting to create havoc as the spring of 1863 progresses. And what he decides to do is to launch an invasion here, to launch an all-out invasion of the North. It's not a desperate attempt, but it's an attempt here to try and get the northern states to realize they can't continue this war indefinitely. Time is not on their side. And you're really going to take it home because up to this stage, basically, the vast majority of the battles were fought exclusively across the southern states. Well, here in June of 1863, Robert E. Lee and his Confederate forces are going to move north. What they most likely were looking to do is they were looking to take the capital city of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, or they were going to attack Baltimore in the state of Maryland and take control of that. Either way, this would be a grave embarrassment to the Union. Well, they decide to focus on Harrisburg, and just as they cross into southern Pennsylvania, what you have, this small rural college town as well, Gettysburg, which it was then, it is now. You have here the most significant battle in the entire American Civil War taking place, the Battle of Gettysburg. July 1st, 1863, it effectively starts. Now, George Meade is the supreme commander here of the Union forces. He knows Robert E. Lee very, very well. Robert E. Lee knows him very well. They both have a good deal of respect for each other. And what George Meade wants here at Gettysburg is he wants to put a halt to this movement, this aggression, this strike that is going to soon be falling the ultimate destination, Harrisburg. And if here the Confederate forces can win at Gettysburg, the road to Harrisburg, the capital city here of Pennsylvania, then as now, would be effectively open. Well, what George Meade is going to do on the first day of battle is he's going to try and hold the high ground. They've got control here of the high ground, places like Cemetery Ridge and Culp's Hill, etc. And on July 2nd here, Robert E. Lee and his forces are going to attempt to take these areas once again. They fail. Meade's forces are able to hold them back. But what Robert E. Lee decides is he decides here on the 3rd of July, the following day, he's going to go with reckless abandon in these areas, up these hills, get the high ground, take them over. It's risky. It's very, very risky, no doubt about that, but this is what the plan, the goal, the hope, the focus, the objective is. Unbeknownst to Robert E. Lee, though, this is exactly what George Meade thinks he's going to be doing, and following well after midnight into the early morning hours, he is rushing in literally thousands of Union reinforcements to solidify here this high ground at Gettysburg. On July 3rd, 1863, Robert E. Lee, who quite frankly, as far as the Confederacy was concerned, was someone who walked on water, is going to demand here Colonel Pickett and his soldiers, more than 10,000 of them, are going to charge across this open field in attempt to capture the high ground at Gettysburg that Meade's forces are in full control of. This is an exercise in futility, and he is warned, Robert E. Lee, and warned by fellow Confederate commanders, this is going to be an exercise in mass suicide. This is the ultimate act here of stupidity, with all due respect. Robert E. Lee turns away from them and said, the enemy is on that hill, and I'm charging up that hill. Well, you have here Pickett's charge, and literally within about 20 minutes, thousands of Confederate soldiers are going to be shot dead here charging across this open field. And the net result on July 3rd, 1863, is the war has now effectively turned. This is a disaster, a catastrophe of unheard of proportions. On the 4th of July, 1863, at Gettysburg, it's over for the Confederacy, at least at this battle, and Robert E. Lee is going to leave. He's going to go into a full-blown retreat. Lincoln had given orders here to his commander, General George Meade, to follow Robert E. Lee's army in the event of winning this battle and destroy it. Destroy it once and for all and bring an end to this war. George Meade hesitates. He allows for the army here of Northern Virginia, this Confederate army, to escape back into the state of Virginia. And Lincoln becomes all the more frustrated. Well, what you have here is a situation that Robert E. Lee's defeat is so significant that he is going to offer his resignation to the presidency, or to the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis refuses. He refuses to accept his resignation. Lee should have resigned. This was a huge disaster, and it's 100% his fault. Davis refuses to accept his resignation because, quite frankly, he doesn't have anybody else. Well, from Lincoln's perspective, what he's going to decide to do after this victory at Gettysburg is he decides here that he needs to have someone to come to the Eastern Theater, somebody who can follow in a very aggressive fashion and put an end to the Southern forces once and for all, to defeat these rebels once and for all, and to keep this nation effectively, to keep it here effectively unified. And that person is in fact going to be, it is going to be here Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant is going to be notified that as William Tecumseh Sherman is going to begin his drive, and has already been on his drive with the Union forces, more of a scorched earth policy, across the historic South, from the Mississippi, the goal, the hope, the focus, the objective, the city of Atlanta, the really only industrialized city in the entire South at this time, the largest city as well in the South. Capture Atlanta, and you're going to march all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to the sea, thereby here setting up the military occupation of the South and really cutting off, isolating here Virginia and the heart and soul of the Confederate forces from that time onwards. Well, for Grant, he is going to be summoned. He is going to be summoned here, that he is going to be coming to the Eastern Theater now to take control of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, the Northern Army. Well, for Lincoln, a very strong student of history, despite the fact he only has 1 year of formal education, from Lincoln's standpoint, you have this massive death toll, tens of thousands of dead at Gettysburg. And the easiest thing, obviously, at this stage is to simply bury all of these soldiers, to bury here all of these soldiers on the battlefield. A couple of cemeteries there as well, one primary cemetery. And in November of 1863, Abraham Lincoln is going to travel off. He is going to travel off by train from Washington, D.C. to Gettysburg. This is a 6-hour train ride, and he's not going to be the primary speaker. There's a Protestant minister that day who's going to be giving the formal address to all of those gathered for this most solemn occasion, which is the dedication of this cemetery, this military cemetery at Gettysburg. But what Lincoln is going to do on the train is he is going to write down a commentary. It's only going to be a few minutes long, only just a few minutes long, but also in terms of not just the dedication of this cemetery, but it's also going to be more of a reflection of this nation going back to the time of the Constitution, more than 80 years before that. And in this case, what the Founding Fathers were envisioning, and what has now happened in essence to the nation at this stage, at this time, and what the future, in fact, would hopefully be. Well, he arrives, therefore, after this 6-hour train ride. He has in his big hat, big top hat, he's got the notes so he doesn't lose them, he puts them right up there. And the first gentleman's presentation goes on for about 45 minutes. Lincoln is then going to come to the podium here in the dedication of the cemetery with hundreds of people there, and he will deliver what becomes known as the most famous of all speeches in American history up to that time, called the Gettysburg Address. Got a bit of an eye issue, so that's what I can remember. My dad he'd be holding paper like when I was like a teenager. He was in his 50s, and I'd be like, "What are you doing there?" He's like, "Yeah, just wait till you get to my age." So I'm in the same boat now. Somewhere he's smiling, no doubt. 77 years ago, Lincoln started. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. From the standpoint of Lincoln, when he formally finishes his Gettysburg Address, he just goes, sits down, there'll be a final overview, so to speak, and the ceremony, consecration is officially a thing of the past. Little did he know the impact that this would have. And it was a superb analysis, not just in terms of honoring, which was his focal point, those who gave their lives, and not just at Gettysburg, but here throughout the American Civil War, this horrific event, but also as well going back, scores, of course, 20 years, so 87 years before that, here to the time of the Founding Fathers and what they were envisioning effectively for this nation. Well, the American Civil War, it's not over, not by any means, but after Gettysburg, by 1864, it was no longer a question of if the Confederacy was going to lose the Civil War, it was rather a question of when. In terms of material, in terms of food, in terms of ammunition, the blockade had had a tremendously significant impact in helping here the Union forces. And with Ulysses S. Grant now in the Eastern Theater, he's not afraid to lose soldiers. He'll be very, very aggressive. He's going to more or less lower his head and charge through. And by all intents and purposes, in early April of 1865, the cause was hopeless for Robert E. Lee and his Confederate forces, and he knew that. And in Appomattox, Virginia, on the 9th of April, 1865, Robert E. Lee had sent word to Ulysses S. Grant requesting here the terms to surrender. And what you have here is a situation that for Grant, he has orders from Abraham Lincoln that the terms are to be very generous, because Lincoln here in his second inaugural address had been talking about binding up here in 1865 in the month of March, binding up here the wounds of the nation, taking care of the orphan, of the widow, etc. And the terms here would be fairly generous. What this meant here is that the soldiers are not going to be going off into POW camps, nor for that matter would be the case with Robert E. Lee. All the men here would be allowed to keep their horses, which was huge because they needed this in terms of farming, heading back now to their respective homes across the South, wherever they may be. And they were also here allowed to keep their arms, provided they promised that never again would they use them in an armed rebellion against the United States as a nation. So the Civil War comes to an end on April 9th, 1865, and for Lincoln, the war had taken a tremendous toll on him, and he was talking with his wife, Mary Todd, a few days later, and was stressing that he'd like to go to the off to Jerusalem, if possible. He'd never been outside of the country of the United States. Wanted to try and put, if at all possible, a good deal of this behind me, different places in Europe as well, here as time, in fact, formally marched on. But by the same end, Abraham Lincoln was receiving a good deal of these premonitions that were quite shocking and upsetting. And the dream he kept having is that he was waking up and it was the middle of a funeral. And everybody here in the White House, they were all dressed in black, and he could see a coffin way up in the front of the room. And he had no idea what this was all about, etc., whose funeral he was at. But then as he got closer here to the front of the room, he could see it was himself. And he told this to his wife, Mary Todd, along with a number of his friends. He said, "I'm not sure what that means." But he said it's more than a bit unsettling. Well, on April 14th, 1865, wanting to basically have a night off here as the Civil War has come to an end and Reconstruction's about to begin, he is going to go to the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia, were supposed to be joining here, the President and First Lady, but they had to back out at the last moment. So what you have here, they'll find other general will come with him with his wife, but they're going to see this play, Our American Cousin. And what happens here is in the late evening of April 14th, Abraham Lincoln is going to be shot by a Confederate sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth, who will escape. He'll be captured a few days later. But you have a situation here that he'll be carried across the street. He never regains consciousness, and he will die in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1865. This nation was literally torn apart by the American Civil War. The Civil War was done, but you have here, arguably, and who most political historians consider to be, presidential historians consider to be the greatest of all U.S. presidents, now no longer there to oversee the road ahead, which would prove to be, in fact, enormously difficult. Well, obviously there's going to be some amendments added to the Constitution. There has to be. And the fundamental reconstructing of this nation will, in fact, formally begin. Well, in 1865, Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated, and the pathway now is this tremendous national mourning across the northern states. And the funeral train is going to follow from Washington, D.C., the exact same path that it followed when Lincoln first came from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C., back here in the late November of 1860. Well, for Lincoln here and this funeral procession, it's going to go on for weeks. Eventually, he'll end up back being formally buried in Springfield. And for the new president, Andrew Johnson, he is going to be facing extraordinary challenges. In 1864, in the election of 1864, because remember, as a president of the United States, you run for a 4-year term. You can follow suit like George Washington, run for a second 4-year term, and then that basically you're done. Well, Lincoln was worried in 1864 he wasn't even going to be reelected, actually. But he easily is able to defeat George McClellan, his one-time general in the Eastern Theater. And he is now going to be he's starting here his second term. But what he did is he brought a Democrat on the ticket, which is very atypical. Very, very atypical, almost unheard of. And the reason being is that Andrew Johnson was a senator from the state of Tennessee. Tennessee here had formally withdrawn from the Union. It had seceded, an act of treason. But Johnson refused. He believed here that for his home state of Tennessee in 1861, this was the wrong decision. And he remained in Washington, D.C. here, seeing himself as part of the United States of America, a statesman still, no doubt about that. So what Lincoln did as an attitude here, an approach of unity, is the Republican Lincoln brought on the Democrat Andrew Johnson to be his running mate. Well, they prevail. The inauguration of Lincoln for his second term in office is in March of 1865. He's assassinated in April of 1865. Well, as the Constitution states, now the vice president is going to take over. The problem fundamentally, Andrew Johnson's a Southerner. His state had seceded. Furthermore, he's a Democrat. And the heart and soul here of the political parties across the historic South was the Democratic Party. And by the same end, he was a slave owner. And he was also known to be very, very sympathetic to the South. So you have here, as far as the Republicans are concerned, they are in control of Congress. And this is like the worst of all worst-case scenarios. Because as far as they are concerned, the South is guilty of treason. And the South was guilty of treason. Blatant treason, no doubt about that. It's a treasonous act. And as far as the northern politicians are concerned, overwhelmingly Republicans are going to take revenge on the South, understandably so. They started the war. We lost hundreds of thousands of lives. We emerged victorious. They're going to suffer the consequences. As far as Andrew Johnson is concerned, that is not going to happen. Rather, he wants to follow Lincoln's approach of caring for the widow and the orphans and binding up here the wounds of the nation. Punishing the South isn't going to help matters, not at all, not in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it's most likely going to be counterproductive. Well, in 1865, in the American Civil War, over 620,000 people died. Of those 620,000 people, 60% of them were from the Union Army. Okay? Remaining 40% were Confederate. So you have here the heart and soul who paid the higher price was the Union for this act of treason on the part of the South. Second of all, you have the South in a state of complete and total economic devastation. As William Sherman was marching here with his soldiers from the Mississippi all the way across destination Atlanta and then beyond, they were ripping up railroad tracks, what few railroad tracks there were. They were burning cities to the ground. They were looting, etc. The South is ultimately and completely destroyed. The railroad industry is devastated, as too is what little industry there was across the historic South. Major cities were destroyed. Fields were destroyed as well. Livestock were slaughtered. So you have here a long road ahead across to rebuild formally the South, to reconstruct it. Third, you have this constitutional crisis. You had 11 former states who seceded from the Union. They formally seceded from the Union. What do you do with them? What do you do with them? How do you treat them? This is an act of treason. Do we round up the governors and put them on trial for treason? How about these military commanders, Robert E. Lee and company? What do we do there? What, in fact, is the wisest path forward? Fourth, you've got a political crisis. A political crisis in that the Republican Party, the prominent political party of the North, is in control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And as far as they are concerned here, the South is going to pay for their crimes in the most destructive war in all of U.S. history in terms of lives lost, up to and including the present day. 620,000 dead in the American Civil War, 410,000 Americans died in all of World War II in both theaters combined. So the Civil War here, especially at the time the population of the nation was much, much smaller. Proportionately, it is massive comparatively. Well, Andrew Johnson is looking for a more conciliatory approach here as this one-time Southerner who now also happens to be president. There's a social crisis across the nation. The social crisis is going to deal with African Americans. 4 million slaves across the South are now effectively free. They are free. What happens to them? What do we do? How do we move forward from this? What's going to become of them? How do we take care of them? How do we protect them? How do we move forward? This became the biggest question of all. And sixth and final, a psychological crisis. A psychological crisis. Both the North as well as the South felt here tremendous resentment, as well as bitterness, anger, interacting here with despair regarding the opposite side. The problems were unavoidable, but the question became one of trying to move forward, the wisest course of action to, in fact, effectively take. Well, for Andrew Johnson, you could argue for the new President of the United States, this one-time senator from the state of Tennessee, the road ahead was going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. And Abraham Lincoln, if he had stayed on, it would have been a very, very difficult movement forward as well, because Lincoln was also indeed more conciliatory. Was he as conciliatory as Johnson? Probably not, but Lincoln, by the same end, would be trusted by his fellow party members, the Republicans. And as far as the Republican Party, front and center here in 1865 is concerned, Johnson is nothing more than a Confederate. How is this guy even in the White House? He shouldn't even be there. He's a Confederate sympathizer through and through, a rebel, a treasonous bastard is what many of the radical Republicans referred to him as. Well, amendments will be added because obviously they would need to be. And you have here the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment, formally passed in 1865. Effectively passed here, 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It formally abolishes the institution of slavery. Abolishes the institution of slavery. Followed here by the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment. The concern on the part of the northern states, especially here delegates in the Northeast in Washington, D.C., is that what was going to happen is that, yes, slavery is abolished. Slavery is abolished, but what's going to happen here to African Americans is they are going to be put in a complete and total second-class standing. They're going to be sharecroppers, plain and simple. They're not going to have any rights whatsoever, and what will happen across the South in the future is going to be nothing but a continuation of slavery in everything but name. Well, with the 14th Amendment here added to the Constitution, you have citizenship being granted here to all residents in the United States, as well as equal protection before the law. Equal protection as well. So this is a concern here. It is a concern in terms of the one-time slaves who are now effectively free. Remember, in terms of how they were counted, we talked about that, the whole 3/5 rule, going back as a compromise to the Constitutional Convention. How did you count slaves at that time? Well, they couldn't be counted as one vote or 0 votes. They'd be counted here as a compromise as 3/5 of one vote in terms of the population as to how much representation you'd have in the House of Representatives as part of the legislative branch. So the 14th Amendment would guarantee here in the Constitution citizenship as well as equal protection. You're born in this country, from this time onwards, you are an American citizen. You are an American citizen. Etched here in the Constitution. The 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was the right to vote to all males. The right to vote for all males. It is a constitutional right, formally passed, the 15th Amendment, and this would be a case of whether you are a male who does not own property, you've just turned 21, whatever the case would be, you're living in Michigan, that doesn't matter. You're living in Virginia, that doesn't matter. Florida, not at all. You're black, white, that doesn't matter at all. You have the right to vote if you are male and you are 21 years of age. So you're going to further enhance this hope on this road towards a more and more democratic republic, the United States. Well, in this situation here for Andrew Johnson, eventually the impasse, politically he's not all that wise, in fairness to the Republicans, and Johnson and the Republican Party here will have a huge falling out, and he will be impeached. He will be impeached and put on trial before the U.S. Senate. He is going to preserve his presidency. He will not be removed from office. Didn't want to be the first president to have that happen to. He will be impeached, but at the trial here he survives, and he survives by 1 vote. What this means, though, for Johnson in 1867 is his political career is pretty much done. He's just going to serve out the rest of his presidency quietly, knowing that in 1868 he is not going to be running for re-election. Well, Reconstruction, therefore, of the historic South, Reconstruction will in fact formally begin. It'll formally begin, and in 1868 is this so often the case with American history, is you have these past military figures becoming then candidates for the presidency of the United States. George Washington, founder here of this nation, classic example of that. Ulysses S. Grant, the hero here of the Union side in the American Civil War, is going to be put up as a Republican candidate for president here in 1868. Dwight Eisenhower, another classic example. World War II hero, lifetime military man, was going to be buried in his army fatigues. It was already instituted in his will. He's elected president of the United States in 1952. Those are just some examples. And in this case here for Ulysses Grant, let's just say he's come a long way since Galena, Illinois. wasn't really exactly sure if he was interested in becoming president or not. It would be much different than the military. He was certain of that. But from Grant's perspective, when he is elected president, he wins resoundingly in 1868. When he's elected president in 1868, what his concern is here is that what's happening across the historic South. Following the defeat of the Confederacy in the American Civil War, the South, for all intents and purposes, at least for the time being, ceases to exist. It is going to be divided into 5 distinct districts. And of these 5 distinct districts, you are going to have the military occupation of the one-time Union Army, now known as Federal Forces. Keep an eye on things, okay? But remember, you're talking a massive area, a very, very large area. And what happens is, as far as white Southerners are concerned, here in the aftermath of the Civil War, we're not abiding by any of these rules. That we're going to have slaves as citizens now, that they have the same rights as white people, that we're going to allow for these former slaves to vote? No, that's not going to happen. And what the Southern society does here, or sets up all these different organizations, different groups. The largest, the most prominent of all was the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And what the Ku Klux Klan was set up here is this white nationalist movement. It was set up to defend the rights of white people across the historic South. And what they would do here as this white supremacist organization is they would terrorize these black citizens. Remember, you have here over 4 million freed slaves who are now citizens. But as far as not just the Ku Klux Klan, there's countless other white supremacist societies that are going to go on the offensive. And you're going to have black churches burned to the ground. You're going to have blacks beaten. You're going to have them lynched. They'll be killed by the hundreds, by the thousands eventually. And for all intents and purposes here, Reconstruction across the South is a complete and total mess. Not working at all. Well, for Ulysses S. Grant, now as President of the United States, he's getting more and more information, receiving more and more information as to what is happening. And there simply is not enough American federal troops here in the South for this Reconstruction. Therefore, what he sees is this passing, coming through the cooperation of Congress, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And what the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 is going to do, it is going to quintuple the amount of federal troops across the historic South. If the southern states want a feeling that they are being militarily occupied by the victorious Yankees, well, they're right. They're right. And they're going to keep a close eye on matters. They're going to be protecting black communities as well. And from Ulysses S. Grant's perspective, what it does is it forces here the Klan and these other white supremacist organizations who oftentimes wear hoods here so they would escape detection, etc., or prosecution. What you have here is these organizations are all forced to go underground. The secret societies, the Klan here, with its origins as a Confederate fraternal organization, 1863, was the largest of them all. So it's a difficult road, no doubt whatsoever. But as far as Ulysses S. Grant is concerned here, as he has quintupled the amount of federal forces across the historic South to keep in effect these constitutional amendments of 13, 14, 15, effectively cemented here as the rule of the land, what you have is Grant being 100% convinced that you have to keep the amount of federal forces here across the historic rebel states, the former rebel states, who are now part of the United States. You have to keep them there until at least well into the early 20th century. He is stressing this here. He is stressing this as of 1874. They're going to have to stay there a long, long time. We've got to prepare for this. It's our only way forward. We have to do this. We do this right. We've got to keep here these massive amounts of federal troops across the southern states until at least 1900 minimum, more likely 1910, 1920. Well, what happens? 1876, Ulysses S. Grant, he had run for election In 1868, he emerged victorious. He ran for re-election. 1872, he wins again. But he's going to follow George Washington's example, and Grant here is going to now retire off to Galena, Illinois. He had a very impressive military career. Presidential career was not as impressive, there's no doubt about that. But nevertheless, as he is leaving here, he had a tremendous amount to be proud of. Well, in November of 1876, we have another presidential election. And it is going to pit here Samuel Tilden, who is a Democrat from the state of New York, against an Ohio Republican by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. And here, for political prognosticators heading into the fall of 1876, they saw this as an election that could be, in fact, very much a toss-up. Could go, in essence, either way. And the reason being is that from 1873 here into 1876, you had a total of 18,000 businesses in this capitalist society of the United States had effectively failed. They had filed for bankruptcy. Unemployment, furthermore, by 1876 had climbed to 14% of the U.S. population. Those are not good numbers by any stretch of the imagination. It's a severe recession. It's not a depression, but it is here a very, very significant recession. So the party that is in office is generally blamed. That's just the way it goes. So Americans tend to be a bit more fickle. You're oftentimes voting against a party instead of for a party. Well, in this situation here for the Republican Party, the Republicans are getting blamed for this heading into November of 1876. So the Democrats, just a few years before, were viewed as a long shot. They were viewed here as a long shot. But what happens in the election of 1876, as all the votes are in fact effectively counted, is the net result is Samuel Tilden, this New York Democrat, and the Democratic Party would still remain prominent across the historic southern states. Samuel Tilden is going to win. He is going to win the popular vote by more than 200,000 votes. More than 200,000 votes. Well, as we know, in the United States, it doesn't matter if you get the most votes. It doesn't mean you win the election. You have to win in the Electoral College. You have to win in the Electoral College because the Founding Fathers had zero confidence in your average American being able to make the right choice, okay? To make the right choice formally in that regard. So what happens here is that in the Electoral College, Rutherford B. Hayes won by one electoral vote. He won here by one electoral vote, the slimmest of slim margins, no doubt about that. So as far as the Republicans were concerned here in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes is the President of the United States. He won the Electoral College. And as far as the Democrats were concerned, well, Tilden received 200,000 more votes. And more importantly, we have evidence of voting irregularities in southern states, which are very, very prominent here in the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democrats carry the South all the way through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then it comes to an abrupt end. So what happens is Samuel Tilden's campaign is going to point here to especially voting irregularities in Florida as well as Louisiana. They pointed out one district in Louisiana in the midterm elections that had taken place in 1874. And in those midterm elections in 1874, in this one district in Louisiana, there were 1,841 votes cast for the Republican candidate. 1,841 in 1874. In the presidential election in 1876, in that same district in Louisiana, there was one vote for Rutherford B. Hayes. How do you explain that? Well, as far as the Tilden camp was concerned, well, Hayes wasn't that popular in that district of Louisiana compared to the predecessors in elections. Well, you've got a constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis here through and through, because as far as the Tilden camp is concerned, they want an investigation. They want an investigation in terms of what was going on across the historic South. Because especially in Florida and especially in Louisiana, As far as Rutherford B. Hayes is concerned, absolutely not. I won the Electoral College. It doesn't matter if I won by 30 votes or I won by 1 vote. I won by 1 vote, that's fine. No more. The Supreme Court isn't exactly sure what to do. And what happens here is by the time we get to 1877, we've got some major issues. Major issues indeed in terms of who's going to be the next president. Well, the two sides get together. They get together here and they're going to compromise. And the compromise of 1877 states as follows. Number one, Rutherford B. Hayes is going to become the new president of the United States, here to be sworn in March of 1877. Number two, the Hayes campaign or the Hayes presidency promises to remove all federal forces from the historic South within 10 months. All federal forces from the southern states, 10 months. So Tilden and the Democrats will agree to this. I mean, Tilden's a northerner, so it's not exactly his idea, but the Democratic Party is the prominent political party of the South, and they want here these federal forces out. They want to take control once again, as they had been prior to the Civil War. Well, you're not going to be able to bring back slavery, but you are here going to bring back, in essence, this complete and total failure of Reconstruction. Because black people across the South, no longer are they slaves, obviously, but they're going to be sharecroppers. They're going to be second-class citizens through and through. Jim Crow will be instituted across the historic South. All of this is against the law. All of this here is in direct contradiction to the amendments in the Constitution, this compromise of 1877. You hope for the best. This is the saying, and it's going to be just fine. Eventually, the dust will settle. Rutherford B. Hayes, from his home in Galena, is absolutely outraged. Absolutely outraged. And he stresses here the fact of what was not handled here properly back at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Now we're removing the troops in 1877. There's no way this could happen until at least the early 20th century. Until at least early the 20th century. The net result here is that nevertheless, it will be done. What it will lead to is well on into the 20th century, the civil rights movement, and understandably so. To close today, you have this population across the United States that is growing by astronomical levels. 1700, we had about 1 million people. 1800, about 5 million. With the onset here of the birth of this new nation in the early 1800s and its growth and its movement westward, what you have first to the Appalachians, then to the Mississippi, then beyond that to the Pacific, or so the story goes. You have a new class coming in, the immigrant class, the old immigrants as they're referred to as from 1810 to 1840. There's tremendous opportunity here in this land. Tremendous opportunity. Overwhelmingly, these newcomers are not just from Europe, they are also here from Western Europe. In terms of religious identification, they're overwhelmingly Protestant, just like mainstream American colonial society was overwhelmingly Protestant. However, with the onset here or the formal end of the American Civil War in 1865, a lot of people, whether they be from Mexico, whether they be from the Philippines, whether they be from Europe, did not want to come to this nation for fear of being drafted either into the Union forces, Union Army, or the Confederate Army, and fighting in a war that they really had no interest in whatsoever. So they didn't come, despite the fact that the United States was looking to attract more and more newcomers, more and more newcomers, more and more newcomers in this immigrant nation for immigrant people. In 1880, the population of the United States had grown. It had grown to 76 million. It had grown here to 76 million. And you have millions of these newcomers here are going to be arriving from 1880 to 1920. And they will be arriving here from parts of Western Europe, but mostly Eastern Europe. Mostly Eastern Europe. And they will also be coming in larger and larger numbers from Canada, from Mexico, and the Philippines. 70% will be arriving here from Europe. And the problem here for this nation, which had always been this nation for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, a Protestant nation for Protestant people, is now you have here people arriving who are not Protestant. They're Jewish. They're Catholic. These people can't assimilate. Are you kidding me? They're hopeless. They're absolutely, completely, and utterly hopeless. They are dumping on us the rock bottom of European society. They are engaged here in alcohol to the extreme in terms of, you name it, crime, gangs, etc. These people are going to undermine our great nation and destroy it from within. The Ku Klux Klan had gone here into disrepair, quite frankly, because it wasn't needed. Jim Crow, this discriminatory practices against black people to keep them as completely, utterly, and entirely second class was fully instituted. He didn't need the Klan. However, here we have Jewish children passing through Ellis Island, early 20th century, with all these newcomers and people who are not white. They're not Anglo-Saxon. They're not Protestant. Dear God, our great nation is going to go to hell in a handbasket because there's no way these people can assimilate. Absolutely, positively hopeless. Well, the situation here for the United States and the challenges ahead would prove to be, in fact, quite enormous. And in this, what would soon be called more and more of a great melting pot, you have this pecking order in this nation. If you could trace your ancestry back to colonial America, by God, you were pretty cool. You were like original. You were legitimate. If you were an old immigrant here, well, maybe in time you could assimilate, but they're very inferior. They're very much second class to us colonial Americans. But with the onset here of these new immigrants, we've referenced this before, the city of Milwaukee in 1920, 70% of the residents of this city were born outside of this country. Oh my God, how could Milwaukee have survived? Think about it. If you're a Catholic or if you're Jewish, the discrimination that your ancestors experienced, I guarantee you, was to the high heavens. In this situation, how to make this transition, this transformation, what to do as this nation, this land of opportunity, is becoming larger and larger, this became a great question. And it also became here a challenge for the United States as a nation, as well as the Constitution and some more most significant amendments that will effectively follow, which we'll look at next time and project to the present and the future. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Any questions at all before we formally break up today? That's it. Yep. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. At this time, the states are not considered states. In the southern states, they're considered, they're under military. So it'd be like kind of the equivalency, in essence, of Germany, 1945. Or the nations, the powers in World War II that surrendered unconditionally. Germany, Japan, classic case example, you had to agree to cease to exist. Germany is divided into 4 zones. Japan, primarily the United States, would take control of. So you have no say whatsoever. You are under a military autocracy, plain and simple. And so this is the attitude for the time being, because they weren't exactly sure what they should do. And it was a case of, there were the radical Republicans who really wanted to punish the South. You have to see it from both sides. But is this wise? I mean, you're just going to go and beat up on the Southerners and not expect long-term implications for that? Isn't it easier to just try and move forward? If you look at the end of World War I, for example, the Allies, the big 3, Britain, France, the United States, beats up on Germany, and the Americans were the least involved, and understandably, because they were only there for really a year and a half in the war compared to the sacrifices that the British and the French made, respectively. But they're not going to In this case, if you're going to do it, you got to do it upright. And this means long-term military occupation of Germany, and the Allies hadn't even invaded Germany. The war had taken 15 million lives. They didn't have a long-term interest in it. So you're going to try and move on. So they're going to punish Germany, but then kind of not enforce it, which opens the door wide open for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to come to power in 1933. Other questions? Oh, yes, sir. The Electoral College. Yeah, if set in the Constitution, and it goes back to the Founding Fathers, who quite frankly had very, very little confidence in the commoners, as they would refer to them as, which would be adult male landowners. Even if they were fairly small landowners, they could still vote. But they didn't have much confidence in them able to make the right decision. So in this situation here, what you're doing is you're setting up an insurance policy, and the insurance policy is the Electoral College. So when you're voting for a president, whether it's George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, whoever, you're technically voting here for electors from that respective party to cast the final vote. So somebody in the Electoral College could decide, well, I'm actually going to vote for the other person. It's happened, but very, very rare. More or less making here a political statement of sorts. In the vast majority of circumstances, though whoever wins the popular vote usually wins the Electoral College. But of course, recently, when you have Al Gore in 2000 and George W. Bush, Gore wins the popular vote. Hillary Clinton defeats Donald Trump. I think it was nearly 3 million popular votes. In 2016, he won the Electoral College. Hence, that's what matters most. So it's something that it's been talked about time and time again in terms of scrapping it, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And the reason being is in fairness, it is fairly rare, though it does happen, and it has happened. But like the French will always say, how can you call yourself a democracy when the person who wins the most votes for presidency doesn't get to be president? And one of the detractors will say, if you do away with the Electoral College, then all the presidents are going to be focusing on are the big states. It's going to be all California and Florida and New York that's getting all the attention. And little old Wyoming is going to be left off to its own devices. Well, that's too bad. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, popular votes should matter. They do in all other Western democracies. So in that sense, it's a case of, yeah, with all due respect, New York does matter more than Wyoming. And if you're from Wyoming, I don't mean this personal. But it's just in terms of numbers. You're not going to have the candidates going there to campaign in the state, because then you carry the state, you get 11 electoral votes or 42 or 3 or whatever would be the case. So, and based on population. So but then of course that's all added up, and it was a way it was done. Is it an elitist approach on the part of the Founding Fathers? Absolutely. 100%. There's no way of denying that. But it's also imperative to think about it from the standpoint of the late 1700s versus 2026, in that regard. So you have it. Yes, sir. Yep. 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 I agree 100%. And I think there was a concern also on the part of the Founding Fathers. Their great concern, as we were stressing a few weeks ago, was with the executive branch, and that it would be relatively easy for a chief executive to see how far that person could push the envelope. And, for example, we talked about this in our Cold War series some years ago, Harry Truman. And Harry Truman is going, it's not the Korean War. He can bypass it by saying it's a Korean conflict. We got to send troops right away. Right? So you have this on the record. You've got Lyndon Johnson with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Okay, he's given a green light. He's asking to retaliate against North Vietnam in 1964, the month of August. And Congress accepts Democrats and Republicans. They don't want to seem unpatriotic, and they give him a green light. So you have, and it's not just a green light to retaliate bombing North Vietnam. It's also a green light to send in ground forces, which he begins doing following his victory in November of 64 to Vietnam. There's 20,000 soldiers sent by the end of March of 65. By the end of that year, you have 200,000 soldiers. So there was concern, and understandably so, on the part of the Founding Fathers that one of these branches is going to get too powerful, far more prominent than it could be, that it should be. And that was the executive branch. They weren't as worried about the judicial branch or the legislative branch. But by the same end, the attitude is one of, well, if we keep the system of checks and balances, I mean, for example, if the Supreme Court comes up and has a proclamation, and the other two branches here, a judgment, whatever the case would be, and the other two branches ignore it, well, the Supreme Court has no way of enforcing it. It means this has to be done in good faith. So you have a constitutional crisis then. So you have this, the floating of the three, trying to keep in terms of checks and balances, et cetera, but you also look at the time this was put in pen to paper, so to speak, 1787, and obviously time changes, and dear God, you know, the population of this nation, we're at about 340 million right now. It's estimated in 2100 we'll be at about 600 million. And for all intents and purposes, it's worked pretty impressively well. For all intents and purposes here, for newcomers to this nation, first generation, it's difficult as all hell, no doubt about that. But it's a case here that things do get a little bit easier. It's easier to assimilate, to blend in this nation, because there's so many people from so many different areas, and I think that's one of the greatest parts of all. Because if history teaches us anything, there's one race, the human race, and the ties that bind us together, for God's sakes, when that's recognized from a global perspective, the ties that bind us together are far more significant than our divisions. When that happens, and if that happens, I can die, Tim can die a happy little historian. Believe me, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Thank you so very much. Any other questions, swing on up. Otherwise, take care. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you next week. Be well.